Hello and welcome everyone to another edition of Connected.
Hello and welcome everyone to another edition of Connected.
It's the second webinar in a month-long series entitled Digital Badges, Opening New Pathways to Opportunities. My name is Alex Halavey. I'm a DML competition winner. I'm also Associate Professor of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Arizona State University. I'm also affiliated with the Learning Sciences Institute there. And I'll be hosting today. I've got two great guests who we'll get to in just a moment. Throughout the month, we're exploring the connection between digital badges and pathways to new academic and economic opportunities, and each of us have a slightly different perspective on that. Today we're going to talk about the role badges play in recognizing and assessing informal learning. And again, however we define that differently among ourselves. Before we jump into our chat, let's go over a few of the details. For those of you over on live stream right now, we encourage you to use the chat there to introduce yourselves, connect with each other, ask any questions you might want us to try to address during our discussion over here on the Google Plus Hangout. And as long as we are on Google+, there's a growing community of people who are interested in connected learning there with now over 2,500 members. We'd love for you to be a part of that and become part of our discussions of badges within that community. The link to the Google+ community should be over there in the live stream chat now, and it is. The link for our public group notes it's a Google Doc for today, should also be over there. We'd love for you to add your own ideas and your own energy in capturing any of the highlights in our discussion and sharing any resources you might have that's related to what we're talking about. That Google Doc will live on and remain open to the public, so we can continue to add to it even after our discussion is through here. We're joined by a couple of my colleagues here and great folks, and I'd hope that the two of you could introduce yourself really quickly. Dan, you want to start us out?
Sure. Dan Hickey. I'm Associate Professor of Learning Sciences at Indiana University. And I've been hanging around badges almost from the very start, and really excited about them, and really thrilled to see how far this has come. Really, and it's only been really about 3 years since around 2010. My team and I here, actually spread all over the country now, have the Design Principles Documentation Project, and we've been we have 2 years to study, learn as much as we can from all of the projects that are that were funded in the 30 projects that were funded in 2012 to develop digital badges, and that includes quite a few informal learning environments, including the sports supporter to reporter medals that I'll have to talk about a little bit today. Thanks.
Cool. I'm Sean Duncan. I'm an assistant professor here in the Learning Sciences program, also at Indiana University. I'm leading the Connecting Badges project here, and that is a project that is aimed at looking at badging and recognition systems in very informal learning environments. So looking at what are called online affinity spaces and trying to document how expertise and recognition of those expertise within online communities is tied to and indicated by badge use. So we're interested in sort of connecting badges and the badges world to this world of very, very informal learning environments, such as fan spaces and productive spaces in online communities. So, yeah.
Great, thanks guys. So I thought we'd start out with really kind of a very broad view. Although we have a specific charge for today, I just wanted to kind of get a view of what you thought was out there and what the really big questions were when it comes to badge research, because we're really talking more on the research end here, and I think when people talk about badge research, depending on the context in which they're doing it, they have very different ideas. At least that's true of me. Dan, do you want to give us an idea of what you think the especially interesting question, not what badge research is as a broad thing, but kind of what you think the especially interesting questions are in badge research right now, and that probably is what you're doing, I suspect.
Yeah, I had a great time with Cheryl Grant at the end. Some of the folks from Mozilla at the Badges Summit, and one of the things that came out of there was some really, I think, important distinctions, sort of a taxonomy that we're throwing out there. Like the distinctions, for instance, there's a big debate over what is and isn't research. And so I'll just say a couple of things about that. We made the distinction between promoted practices, proven principles, and peer-reviewed evidence. So we're going to try to run with that. so that's a big distinction for us. Another one is that central to the design principles project is that a real interesting distinction between research of digital badges and research with digital badges. Many people are just beginning to appreciate something that I'm just incredibly excited about, is the fact that if an organization has worked hard to negotiate what learning is going to be recognized, sort of what learning is going to recognize, what claims you're going to make about that learning, and what assessments you're going to generate evidence to support that learning, the data that is contained in the metadata in the badges that you've issued are a tremendous source of evidence for studying learning, both for sort of summative program evaluation, but for sort of design-based research. So that's sort of at the really high level in research on digital badges. That's the kind of thing that I'm really excited about, and really excited to see. Nicole Pinkard has started doing some really interesting work with her data from Summer of Learning. So there's a lot of really great stuff happening. I've got some good evidence coming out of my MOOC my book with digital badges. So, Sean?
Yeah. So one of the big questions for me, and what's really motivated this project that we're now starting on here at IU, is how badges live and evolve in very, very informal kinds of contexts. So the big question for me is, what do people think about badges in these spaces? How do people negotiate what badges are? How do people negotiate more beyond badges with recognition systems in other badge-like forms? Things like credibility and legitimacy and trust. Carla Casilli has written on those in some really excellent blog posts last year that have been really inspirational for our team in trying to understand not just how badges are working within particularly structured environments or after-school programs or spaces in which we're trying to understand how to credentialize or validate the kinds of practices that happen in those kinds of spaces. But what about the very messy and strange and interesting interest-driven spaces online that in many ways have served as, I would argue, an impetus for the badge movement to begin with. That is, what really has pushed this recent development of badges has been a desire to try to capture and understand something about the forms of learning that we haven't already been able to capture, understand, and credentialize and inspire in the past. So I'm interested in actually going back to those practices, and I'm getting a sense of the kinds of recognition systems and badges that are already out there, and seeing what we can learn from those. These can be in commercial contexts, these can be in fan spaces, these can be on sites ranging from Reddit to communities such as Twitter, and then try to understand something about what needs to happen for the next generation of badge development. Because we want these to live in the world, and we want these to actually promote learning in a variety of different kinds of contexts. So we should have a better sense of how the existing kinds of recognition systems are living out there.
Alex, do you want to answer that question? I think you've got some opinions and ideas that I think the audience would be very. I know you're the moderator, but
well, I like the observer. I just kind of poke holes at you guys. So I think this informal. So let me start by saying that my background is not in education. Other than as a faculty member, I'm interested in higher ed and doing weird stuff there. In fact, I guess what got me interested in badges in the first place was to undo education. I really wanted to break the university, and I try not to say that as much these days because it's really hard to get administrators to uptake badge systems if you're telling them that the reason you're doing this is because you want to break the university. But so as saboteur was my original plan for badges, and part of that actually plugs in a little bit to Dan's idea of kind of badges as research, and research through badges and of badges, right? And so I think of that in some ways as kind of again, I'm not Dan's the assessment guy. I don't really know what assessment is. I'm just pretending, but I like this idea. We're starting a new master's program at my university, and we thought about badges because it not only lets you know what the students know, but what the students with the S on it knows. Not just what an individual student knows, but what the students know as a group, and what the program knows or can teach as a group. And so it's nice to have that assessment that works not just for the individual, but that you can then roll up and say, what does this community know? And what does this community know outside of the boundaries of, say, a traditional educational structure? And so that informal piece, the informal-formal piece, has always been problematic for me because my whole teaching kind of credo in the classroom is to try to break down those walls and say, let's see what we can do that's not within the university, that's not within the classroom, that's not formal. And I think so for me, the badges represent that bridge between formal institutionalized learning and informal structures, and being able to track learning that moves from one place to another. And so I think, Sean, you'll have to stop me if I'm wrong on interpreting this, but I think your focus is looking at informal learning communities within those communities to a certain extent. So what do Redditors think about Reddit, other Redditors, and how they're learning stuff? And my interest is really heavily on moving people from one context to another, and whether you can, if you are known very well within a particular community online, can you move that expertise to another space, either interest-driven or more formal, and what happens when you move there, and how can you represent your experience from another context once it's been divorced from that context? So that's my main interest in badges, is how do you not just have credibility within the community, some kind of recognition of expertise, but what happens when you leave that community? Can you take some of that with you, and how is it reinterpreted once you move to another space? So our group is doing things like, we're right now focusing on, so we could back up a little bit here, but among the very large number of badges issued through the OBI, through the Open Badge Infrastructure, very few of them are being shared in that way across contexts. People are putting them in their backpack, but that's a black hole for most of these badges, and most people when they're using them within their context. The exception to that are people tweeting things like Foursquare badges. Increasingly, things like Khan Academy badges are making their way onto Twitter, which is kind of outside its original area of contagion. And so we're kind of doing one of the things we're doing is doing instant surveys of those people that tweet out their badges saying, why the hell did you do that? What spurred you to kind of share this, so that we can understand why people want to move their badges out of the original context. So that's kind of my interest. Dan, can you give, I want to make sure that we tease out this badges as research, and I don't think I've gotten this right, but as research or through research piece. Can you give me like a concrete example of what you mean by that? What it would look like?
Yeah, one that really got me excited was what Global Kids did in a really simple pilot in their work with Learning Times. The data that Learning Times provided them, they were able to turn it around, and Global Kids is a pretty good example of an informal learning space. It's the kind of ones I'm most interested in. I differ a little bit from Sean, because Sean really doesn't want his world's tainted by the formality of education for the most part, which I think is great, because we really get to see what can happen. Whereas Global Kids was I categorize it as a semi-formal place, in that there's some expectation of accountability, right? If you're getting money from people in particular, if you're using public funds, public space, whatever, people want to know what's happening. They want some evidence. They just want, what are you doing with your space and your money and our kids? And so they were able to, in a report that's up on the web, I'll post a link if I can find it, they were able to quite readily write a report that was much, much more comprehensive than anything that most informal learning organizations ever produce. I mean, I have done a lot of sort of program evaluation in my life and helping out social service programs and educational programs, and they struggle mightily to say anything that's really comprehensive and convincing about what they do. Whereas just by looking at the data, literally the data associated with each of their badges, Global Kids was able to show for two programs quite easily and for my purpose, quite convincingly, what people had done and what people had learned. And because the evidence is contained in those badges, you can actually click, if you want to verify it, you can actually click on it and see, well, what artifacts did they put up? What is the evidence associated with this claim? And so for my money, that's a huge, that's the game changer. That's why I think that digital badges are what I call a sort of transcendent form of assessment, because they're so readily going to transcend the constraints that many people have on getting actual evidence of learning. You don't need an assessment. You've got the badge.
So that's, I want to kind of pull that out a little bit more, because one of the discussions that happens on the Open Badges list and elsewhere is, this question of whether badges and assessment are being conflated. Could Global Kids be doing this the same kind of assessment process, the same kind of individualized assessment and then demonstration without the badges? In other words, what is the badginess of this add to it?
Sean, you want to take that, or?
No. Actually,
Okay, yeah. So from my
I was
perspective,
nodding that it was a very good question. So.
so I've been having to write these little terse descriptions of badges these days, and the one that I've come up with that seems to resonate is that badges contain detailed claims about learning. They contain links to actual evidence of learning that supports those claims, and they're shareable over the web. So we haven't seen, there's been nothing like that. There's been no infrastructure, there's been no backpack. I mean, yeah, we've got some work to do with how this all works together, but because of that, and because of what we have seen in the design principles documentation project, going back to, certainly David Wiley is the one in particular who quite rightfully points out that badges are not assessment. That is true. That's 100% true. Badges are credentials, but credentials always have assessment associated with them. And the problem with traditional credentials is you have no earthly idea what even the claim is, not to mention what evidence or what assessment is associated with it. So you can actually put that information in a badge and say, this person, this is the evidence, this is the assessment, here's the artifact that the student produced, here's a link to the artifact, and here's a reflection that the student wrote on that artifact that was submitted as evidence that they actually learned some underlying stuff. That's all pretty darn different from anything we've seen before.
Sean, does that hold, do you think, as you move into some of these informal spaces? I mean, I think we have part of the problem I've had is when you say badges, it means something to somebody. And it's almost kind of like a word association test, whether they go to Boy Scout badges or they go to gaming badges. And It seems like the badges are growing. We have, I think the definition Dan gave is the OBI definition of badges. It has linked to evidence and all the rest of it. I don't know that that's associated with in a lot of the informal spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitional issue is a key one for the project that we're working on right now, because I've actually not referring to these specifically as badges. I see badges as being one of many different kinds of recognition systems. So, for instance, I mentioned Reddit earlier. The very idea of upvoting and downvoting and the amount of karma that one accrues within one of those kinds of spaces is not a badge by any means, but it is some way of recognizing participation within the space, or recognizing, in some cases, some subreddits, it could end up recognizing knowledge or wit or social facility. Those are the kinds of things that we still don't have a really good handle on how they work and how people think about them. I think once we start once we start looking at the continuum of different kinds of recognition systems, from these very loose ones that might capture some degree of expertise to ones that are explicitly about credentialing, then I'm really interested to see what kinds of interactions people have got with these and the ways they move them between spaces, like you were saying earlier, but also the ways that they critique and negotiate what the meaning of those things actually are. So one of the questions that's been sort of nagging at me about the badges world has been how do people actually perform using digital badges differently than people who are not perhaps particularly interested in picking up digital badges. And I'm talking about the very, very informal spaces. So in some spaces like Stack Overflow, they've got a real currency that can actually lead to real-world consequences. In other spaces, such as, say, I study a lot in gaming communities, and spaces such as Steam, which is an online digital delivery system and community for digital games, they serve a very commercial purpose. So I raised this question for all of us before we were planning, and I'm really curious to tease out a taxonomy of different kinds of informal uses of badges, because I see there is we're using one term to characterize many, many different kinds of things out there. And it's an empirical question. What are all of these things, and how do people think about them differently according to these different kinds of communities?
As part of the things we were doing with that instant survey piece, we had to tease out the difference between, and so moving towards that taxonomy, the difference between check-ins, karma, broadly interpreted, and badges. And so check-ins are kind of, I'm doing this right now, just a sort of awareness around you kind of a thing. The badge, sort of the karma piece is really interesting because what badges, one of the advantages, theoretically, at least one of the advantages to badges is that you can attack things in different orders and in different ways. So let's say on Stack Overflow, you can get your badges in a variety of different orders or make your own pathway through the stuff. But a score is a score. It's a single linear comparison. And again, to go back to the Boy Scouts, it's kind of the difference between I made Eagle Scout and I have a large number of merit badges, right? The merit badges are the space you can kind of move through, but there is also a very clear linear path. I'm wondering, so maybe those are three different kinds of things. What am I missing in that taxonomy? Are there other interesting examples of that kind of reputational system?
Well, so for instance, in the game communities right now, I've been looking at Steam a little bit just because they've got a number of badging systems. It's a commercial site, but it's also a site that's actually trying to promote and foster sort of cross-gaming fandom in some way. They've also got, like I said, a commercial interest, and they've been trying to motivate people to participate within these spaces by not just having badges, but by having a gamified element to these badges. So, for instance, at the last Steam summer sale, they used trading cards. So the certain number of purchases you made of games, you would end up getting trading cards, and you might end up with 3 trading cards of one type and 1 of another type. And you would actually motivated players to actually interact with other players to try to trade these around in order to build a badge. So you would construct them in order to build a badge. This is very different from the kinds of badges that we normally talk about in this community, but they are badges out in these spaces that happen to use a gamified kind of structure in order to motivate participation, motivate purchasing. You have to be very upfront about that, but also to, in some ways, signify some kind of expertise in these spaces as well. That is, you know something about how to trade with other people within these spaces. You have got some degree of social facility in that you're knowing where to trade with others in these spaces. And those are the kinds of things that really motivate the work that I'm interested in right now, because I don't see us doing very much that's to that degree of gamifying of badges. We're more interested right now in sort of justifying how badges are connected to the kinds of learning goals that we've got, and I think that's very important for us to do. But my interest in looking out in the wild, into these wildly interest-driven kinds of spaces, is to look for inspiration for the next round of badge development. Are there things that these are doing in these kinds of contexts that could be useful for us in the design of the next generation of badge systems?
Dan, I don't want to jump in front in case if you have something to say on this, just ignore me. But I'm curious about this from your perspective of the earlier example, especially. I've always been really interested in this idea of people coming up with their own badges. That is, building the badges from below. How does that work with assessing a program, for example? I mean, is there a tension there between both these multiple paths where people say, I can get at this information a different way, which makes it very difficult from a curriculum designer's perspective, especially, because you have to not just design one curriculum, but kind of multiple paths through a subject, but also how much of this can we put in the hands of a community? I mean, I think that may actually be a definition of an informal learning community, is they are choosing their own topics and targets for interest, and how does that play off in the intention of, in a more maybe more formal or more institutionalized learning environments?
Philip from P2P University, when we first had this meeting in 2010 about badges, Philip made a point that just knocked me off my feet, and that was that, okay, in peer-to-peer university, you can set up a course so that the machine issues a badge, and you can set up a course so that the community issues a badge. But the really cool thing is you can set up the course so that the community tells the machine when to issue the badge. And that, to me, is just, what we need to do, I think, as a community is help people realize that that's evidence. I mean, people are looking for proof. People are looking for what works and all this stuff. It's like, wait a minute, would you people just step back for a second and say, that's going to make a big difference. If you can have both of those things happening and happening synergistically, that is proof of concept. That's something fundamentally different in recognizing learning is happening. So I think that's my response to that is, and I mean, we've seen some just amazing things happen on these projects as they really get together and I mean, you look at the Smithsonian and the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum. I mean, they brought in, weekend-long events that were involved graphic designers, learning experts, programmers, getting together and negotiating what learning they were going to recognize and how they were going to recognize it. And that included, in my recollection, that included some sort of open-ended sort of stuff, like they recognize, oh, well, can we have a badge that's a learner-defined badge? So when a community comes together and recognizes the value of a learner-defined badge, you're like way ahead of the game. We're doing the same thing in my open ed course, and it's not informal, but we're going to, when someone earns the badge for completing the assessment course, we will invite them to say what words they want to put on there. Do they want to be an Indiana assessment expert, a national assessment expert, an ed tech assessment expert? That'll have huge implications for whether or not people value the badges well enough to push them out to social networks, which is really the crucial step that has to happen if this ecosystem's really going to sort of take off.
I'm in Dan's class, and I just want to say I want to have the first Martian assessment. I'm going for that. I figure
okay.
End of one.
Okay, you better get that book and get started. Awesome.
So I wanted to kind of, this peer question is an interesting one, because what I've found is that when peers assess it, they often use what's sometimes called the Casablanca test for pornography, which is I know it when I see it. They often do a bad job of being explicit about what evidence counts in order to get that badge, but they will say that we know as a community what it is when we see it. And I've actually seen this not just in kind of informal environments, but when I talk to people about badges who are doing admissions, doing hiring, that kind of thing, they say, and I ask them, what badge would you get? And they say, well, I don't really do programming. I'm at a much higher level than I would expect for badges. And I said, well, do you have any skills? Can you, do you have any sort of soft exposure? And you said, yeah, yes, they'll say. But really, the only way you would get at that is endorsement from other people who have the same set of skills. They can't say that there's evidence. They could just say, they might give examples, but those examples are always going to be anecdotal. They're always going to be individual and unique. I wonder if that's a problem of badges more generally, or the way we're conceiving of badges. And I think this, looking especially at the informal environment, really gets at that a bit, because maybe there aren't very clear. There isn't that clear rubric that you might expect in traditional kinds of assessment. Is that fair to say, or am I just kind of off base on that? Either of you. Anybody.
It sounds pretty fair to me. I mean, I actually want to defer to Dan on this one, but one thing that has concerned me is, and I guess this is really what's been motivating this project that we're working on right now, is getting a sense not just of whether or not somebody thinks a badge is capturing, or other recognition system is capturing expertise, but what they see as being the role of actually going after and finding badges even worthwhile to pursue. That is, in a lot of these very, very informal spaces, I want to understand something about how people are not just creating new badges, not just sort of recognizing what badges are and recognizing what expertise is, but how they're linking that specifically to why one is even participating within one of those kinds of spaces. So I think in more formal environments, the why somebody's even participating in those spaces is a little more clear, or at least we would like to think that it's a little more clear. In these very informal spaces, I think there's a panoply of reasons why people are participating, and that really muddies the water, and that's why this is interesting to look at. But I don't know. I wonder if Dan has other comments on that.
Yeah, I'm all up in this. I think this is a really exciting topic. One of the things that I've learned from you, Sean, is that if we do the value of looking at these very informal, these resolutely informal spaces that resist formality, is that you get to learn things like, if you look at them closely, you realize there's no such thing as peer assessment, right? There's peer endorsement, and that was really behind the motivation behind the peer recognition system in my current course, which is no one's saying this is good, no one's saying this is better than anything. It's saying, here's this simple criteria. In our case, it's complete. This thing appears complete. Click on a button if you want to say that you think your classmate's thing is complete. That's a very, very different thing than asking people to evaluate other people's stuff. So one of the big lessons that has come out of our project is that most of the projects we studied had, one of their intended practices was peer evaluation. And for a whole range of reasons, the most salient being that it's so hard to do peer evaluation, very few of them are actually ended up with enacting peer evaluation. It almost always goes by the wayside. So, that's a good example of the kind of thing that we can really learn from people like Sean is that look and see what happens in peer recognition communities in these informal spaces, and then look and see why they don't work in these semi-formal spaces, and there's a lot to learn.
But I guess I would disagree a little bit in the sense that there is peer evaluation that does occur. I'm not saying it's widespread. I'm not saying that it's necessarily the predominant activity. But when you start looking at, so for instance, I've done a lot of work on gaming communities. Constance Steinkuhler and I wrote a paper several years ago looking at informal scientific practices, and that's about as peer evaluation-y as you can get, in which they're really digging deeply into the mechanics of the game World of Warcraft, trying to mathematize it, trying to evaluate theories and pick them apart. So these things happen in certain hobbyist and fan kinds of communities. I guess one of the things I'm really interested in doing is seeing how does that stuff turn into something that's recognized by the community. Are those things connected to the work that we were talking about was long before really the current badges interest started kicking up. Now there are more and more recognition systems in some of these spaces, and I'm interested in connecting those kinds of practices to existing badging systems, or at least investigating how people within these spaces actually connect them or don't connect them.
Yeah, I'd have to bounce back on that too, Dan. I mean, I have an example, and admittedly, it's in a more formal setting. It's in a graduate course, and when I originally tried using badges, it was very much an endorsement. Does this meet the minimum requirements for evidence for this particular badge? And there's two things for that. One is that students wanted to be able to say more than that, so I gave them a box, and then students wanted to be able to say that not only have they met it, but they've far exceeded it, so that they could make so I ended up with a slider bar saying how, not just did you not just check, but how far did you go, and then a little mark saying that, this 50% is the minimum, how far did they go, or are they way off to the side of this? And part of that I really thought was important, because I think the development of expertise in anything is the ability to assess what's good and bad. In other words, be able to have a very nuanced assessment, and eventually be able to have a nuanced assessment not just of other people's work, but your own work. I mean, the real key of becoming an expert in anything is that not only can you assess other people who have gone behind you in some ways, or are trailing your groundbreaking work, but you can look at something and say, is this any good? Before you give it to anyone else. So you're doing that same kind of assessment to yourself. So I think that's pretty essential, at least from what I see, in how to get people to use this, at least for an idealized version of it.
Yeah, we do, in fact, also in my class, we do have the leader badge, and there's both an endorsement and then a promotion function. But the main thing is we just need to be really careful, and people need to recognize, I guess, probably the most important thing, that as you move into more and more formal spaces, it gets more and more difficult to do peer recognition. That's probably the main takeaway, is that once you start attaching any serious consequences to them, it gets really hard. As they get more and more summative, they get more and more problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one reason why with our current project we're really trying to look at a range, a continuum of formal instructional on one end, or at least sort of verging on formal instructional on one end, all the way to these very, very loose informal spaces. Primarily for the very reason Dan was mentioning there, that is, what are the different kinds of recognition practices that end up happening over that entire period, or over that entire continuum.
And if you want a really great sort of apocalyptic version of this, it's LinkedIn's endorsements, which are entirely meaningless, which encourage you to say this person has a skill in something you may never have studied yourself. It actually, the affordances for the interface there are, please endorse everyone you know in whatever topic anybody has ever said they're any good at. And so you do have this kind of the race to the bottom problem with peer endorsements and maintaining that quality level.
I thought there were some communities with sub-communities with LinkedIn where endorsements mattered.
Well, so there's two different kinds of endorsements, right? There's the letter endorsement, the kind of endorsement that if you're a consultant, you ask people to write for you to say that you helped them out of this wonderful issue. And then there's the new kinds of endorsements where you just click and say, yes, this person knows how to teach online. I've never taught with them. I've never had a class with them, but I'm willing to do that. There is also this issue. I don't really write even the written endorsements on LinkedIn anymore because they're almost always reciprocal.
Yeah.
Even for my students, when the students ask me to write one, I would write one for them, but then they would write one back for me, and it would be meaningless because you could see instantly that it was a reciprocal endorsement, and so that kind of kills it. I had that problem. Well, I had that problem. This is going back a long time ago when I tried to do karma within a class, and I had people actually exchanging physical favors. That sounds bad, but it's actually as bad as it sounds. For karma, joining kind of upvote brigades where they swore to downvote everyone not within their own fraternity in some cases. So it turned into this horrible structure of, again, the system that was designed to try to put learning at front actually took over and became, and we see that with Reddit. Obviously, there's this post of I hit 1 million karma yesterday.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess one of the things that's sort of in the work that we're doing is why do we care about those kinds of spaces? Why are we interested in those kinds of spaces? Well, one of the things we don't want to do is obviously make design digital badges that end up replicating any of that kind of activity. And I'm not sure yet how we do that. And I think that's why we need to go back to these spaces and learn a little bit more about what kinds of phenomena lead to that. Is it because, I mean, so in your class there was obviously a fraternity kind of thing that was getting in the way of your use of that, or was perhaps just evolving out of the environment of college students? There have been concerted efforts to do that kind of upvote, downvote thing over the years. There's a very big scandal on Dig several years ago about that. So those are the kinds of things that when I talk about the ways that recognition systems and badges live out in the world, those are the ways that they live out in the world. People are taking these tools and they're using them for other purposes that might not be what we designed them for. And understanding how these things have been designed as well as how they're being used is really what we're trying to do.
How much of that, Dan, can we rely on you for in your project, this kind of a horrible catalog of things not to do, not just like worst practices? Can we get a worst practices for badging?
You know, that's been an interesting challenge. That is actually our huge challenge, and Nate Otto and Christine Chow are helping us make new worked examples now because, and they're awesome because they understand that what we're trying to do is to take some of these projects that essentially have failed and say, and turn that around into a lesson. That's a big challenge for us as a project because we want to earn their trust. Frankly, I'm really pleased with what's happened in the last just really month or so. Is what we've really done is reframe our work in the notion of challenges. And basically, you know, when it comes to the learning that you're going to, you know, you have your recognition, assessment, motivation, and research. Those are the sort of 4 practices we're focusing on. Well, the learning that you're going to recognize is fundamentally constrained by the system within your working. And many of the challenges that were uncovered, you can attribute it to that. You can explain what was it about your context that made it so difficult for you that prevented this from working. And that way we can offload help them frame what they did is a valiant effort to overcome institutional inertia to this transformation of the credentialing practice in that ecosystem. And then all of a sudden you can get them on board. And then that cascades down the list. You say, well, once you've made decisions about what learning you're going to recognize, you have serious constraints. If you have decided you're going to have very summative assessment practices, good luck with peer assessment. It's going to be very difficult. And so that's what we're really trying to do is to push the sort of, you know, say, well, that practice simply wasn't appropriate for that setting. What was it about that setting that made that practice inappropriate? So that's I think what we're going to be able to contribute. If we can get that up in working examples, there's some on the home page. There are links to the working example that we've just finished, that Nate Otto just finished for the supporter to reporters medal, that gets at some of it. And there's an interview that Roshni Varghese did with Cliff Manning and Lucy Neal, where they really talk quite frankly about the challenge that they encountered. And I think that that's, we're really blessed to be working for MacArthur because they really get it, that building a community where you can talk about your challenges and the difficulties and say this failed and here's how we're doing differently is a huge sort of accomplishment, I think, for our community to be to that point already.
Yeah, it's interesting. The use of the phrase challenges is interesting, in part because I'm pushed back to, you had mentioned Philip Schmidt at PDPU, that challenges and badges have been linked together in a different context for a long time, right? We often consider, rather than rubrics, we call them challenges, and that, I think, that the use of that language is interesting because it suggests that failure is as I say to my class, failure is a great option. It's something that we want to encourage, not just kind of meeting a minimum level, but actually trying something, failing, and evaluating why it's failed. I just want to push back for a second because I'm not sure what our audience is. You mentioned that you shouldn't have peers do summative assessment. Can you please remind us what summative assessment is, and then give us a clear idea of why it is that peers have a problem with that?
Well, I actually violated my own rule in some respects to all assessments have both summative functions that are more providing evidence of prior learning and predicting future learning, and all assessments also have actual or potential or actual formative functions that are the act of taking the assessment either for the individual or the ecosystem supports additional learning. So that's the main point there, is that as you get more and more focused on making claims about what someone knows and will be able to do, things like peer assessment can become quite problematic quite quickly.
Yeah, I had something interesting with that grad class again, where I had them evaluating each other and assessing their work. And they wanted, I got some feedback at the end of a couple of courses where they said, we really wanted to hear you on this. And so I thought, oh, they want some of my expert feedback. And that's not what they wanted. They just wanted me to endorse the badge. They wanted my kind of expert imprimatur that the assessment that had happened was real and signed off on by a real honest-to-goodness professor. And so that was the key, that they didn't want me to be providing them feedback so much as signing off on this being a real learning experience that really, counted, which was a kind of an interesting piece of feedback.
That's the kind of observation that led me to change. When you said overturning the system, I said maybe we need to think about unraveling the system, because I think that a big chunk of the institutional inertia, we always want to try to attribute it to the institution, but the institution and the values of the institution is co-constructed by the values of the participant in the institution, and things are bound together pretty tightly in some respects.
So that retrospective question comes to a question that was asked a long time ago over in the live stream that I want to pull over, which is how do we deal with questions of awarding badges in one context for experience or things learned in another context? In other words, I've had this trouble looking at badges not that I've designed. I tend to do badges, and students either like or don't like this, which say, can you do this? Rather than show me your work. I don't care about your work. Show me that you can do something. And so the question is about, assessing skills and knowledge learned elsewhere within a different context, which I find interesting. But I'm wondering what you guys think about that.
And Dan's comments here were just starting to make me think about this a little bit more, I guess, overtly than I have in the past. And that is the issues of power and the issues of who's actually giving the badges and how are they actually working within the institutional goals of whatever the space happens to be. So for us, in terms of the spaces we're looking at, I'm very interested to see how the people who are actually running the sites actually think about badges and badge development. That is, what do they see the purpose of these badges actually being? That's something that we are hoping to actually get to later in the year, when we're going to start to conduct some interviews with people who are both participants within these sites as well as people who are outside of them. But that's a big concern for us, is getting a sense of how badges are not just something that is used by individuals within these spaces, but they're actually validating and I guess are implicitly showing the ways that individuals within, oops, just hit my computer, the ways that individuals within these spaces are trying to achieve something from a particular person within power within one of those spaces, whether that's a teacher or whether that happens to be somebody who runs, say, a video game that they're very interested in.
Yeah, so I think there's an important. Alan Collins long ago made this really important distinction between this notion of just-in-case learning and just-in-time learning. And the fundamental challenge with a good deal of education and a non-trivial part of informal education is it really is concerned with just-in-case learning. We're really trying to help people learn things they're going to need, and so it's often quite difficult to have someone do something in a way that's convincing that they'll be able to do it again in the future in some different context. So, I mean, I think that's a great question that someone asked. I know that the Badge Works for Vets is one of the projects we're studying, and they're trying to, it's a bit of a different context, but, you know, I think the important question is to go back to Carla Casili's, you know, fundamental point about credibility. If, you know, you look at, say, Strayer University, they're just blitzing the airwaves with these ads that's saying, hey, we're going to give you a degree for what you already know. Well, when I see that, I think they're just cashing out because they're destroying the credibility of their institution to the point that you know, they'll collect a bunch of money from people, and by the time those people have, you know, taken the additional courses they require, you know, Strayer's going to run with the money because by bombarding the airwaves by saying that, hey, really, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you know, we're going to give you a degree for what you already know. If they don't back that up in some way, their credibility is going to go away quickly. And because of the way that Carla describes the credibility in P.J. Fogg's work on credibility on the internet, credibility is constructed very, very quickly, and you can lose it very quickly. All it takes is a serious exchange of doubt in a trust network for some sort of credential to become pretty worthless overnight. And so, you know, I think that this is going to be interesting to see as people try to, I know that the Credly, and Alex, I know that you're very interested in these kinds of systems for giving people credit. And so I wonder what your opinions are about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It's you know, in theory, I like the idea of being able to lend credibility in some way to stuff that's been learned elsewhere. And so there's two sides to this. I think you're giving an example where the person will disappear. I think in the OBI community, they're talking about endorsing this, endorsements from people that have long histories of sort of, I would call it kind of a credibility inertia. I talked at Yale, this is going back almost 4 years ago now, and they had just started to become affiliated with the University of the People in California, which was an interesting project. But I think they were skittish about this idea of lending themselves and endorsing badges. But there is this kind of piece of can you take that? Can you take institutional credibility and lend it to something that is much more dynamic? You know, that's one piece, and I'd be very interested to see how that space works out, because it's a brand. You know, this is a branding issue in many ways, right? Universities want to control their brand, and yet they want to be able to use that brand in interesting ways, and traditionally they've focused a lot of that on the diploma. You know, that's what we put our name on. That's what we put our brand on. We're branding you as a Stanford graduate. And to then say that we are branding you as someone who has done some work that has been endorsed by someone that Stanford endorses, it'll be interesting to see whether that actually fleshes out. I think that again, it probably for me comes down to the peer assessment piece. And whether this works or doesn't, I don't know. But if I can be accepted within, you know, I think we could go back to coffee houses, or we could go back to, you know, the very origins of how we do science and this idea of an academy of peers. If I can prove that what I've done is valuable to that academy of peers, it's a collective branding. And I think that academy, instead of being a university that has someone to sit down and look down at your resume and say, oh yeah, he worked for this company for whatever, we like him, we'll collect his $500 and give him a degree. If you have a group of peers, again, I give counterexamples to this, but they might develop this very defensive attitude of, we're only going to accept people into the peerage that will defend us as a peer community. And so this is a kind of maybe utopian thinking, but that's the way I see it working, is as a community of peers who want to protect their reputation collectively.
But this also, I think this also goes against what you were saying earlier about karma, right? The kinds of ways that we see human social interactions and the ways that certain kinds of in-group, out-group kinds of behaviors might end up influencing that peer evaluation process is a concern for me, actually. So if we talk about the scientific enterprise, obviously there have been many, many cases in which various folks have not been validated by a particular community who were doing interesting and good work. This is not to say that institutions should necessarily take on that role only and be the ones who are granting what counts as learning in valuable ways, but I'm a little skeptical that the peer evaluation component is going to completely work itself out, just because of the kinds of spaces that I'm studying right now, in which you see internet mob-like behavior sometimes in certain Reddit forums, or you see these in a variety of online spaces, places that can be very, very productive and can involve the recognition and display of all kinds of expertise, and I would argue the peer evaluation happening within them also are going to succumb to these kinds of social problems that I think are going to muddy the waters a bit. But that's just me. I don't know if Dan has a different thought on that.
Dan, I think you've muted yourself, actually.
Thank you. I was looking at there's some more points. I'm trying to see if there's anything we need to, we're running out of time here, and there's some really interesting questions coming up here about credit recovery and failure.
Yeah, I'll take
I don't think I have anything to add to that particular point, though. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just the badges of failure. I've tried to do that. It's really difficult to do it right. The sort of glorious failure badge. I did when I introduced myself as a DML competition winner, but I'm also a DML competition loser, or as they like to call us, unfunded winners. And I did produce a badge that was an unfunded winners badge that I've quietly distributed over email to those who felt they earned it. And so I think there's a place for that, but I think it's also funny that none of them wanted to wear that badge. I think that's a really interesting idea. I think it's kind of hard to do in practice. And what I've found instead is this idea of the sort of incomplete badge. That is, I mean, people have talked about this as kind of, can you have Trivial Pursuit's pieces of pie and go through it that way or something? But this idea of a badge that's still in process, because a failed badge does suggest that you failed and walked away from it, and an incomplete badge just says, I'm getting towards this badge, I just haven't gotten there yet. And so I think those are two different kinds of things, especially for public display.
Mm-hmm. I think that's interesting. Yeah.
Great. So I'm going to kind of start to bring us towards a close by asking a question that I ask actually of our respondents when we're doing focus groups on badges, and that is, and it has. So I'll precurse this. The question is, if you were going to have a badge that represented your particular abilities and that does not exist yet, what would you do? In other words, this goes to your design your own badge thing, and it has the unfortunate appearance of being the if you could be a tree, what tree would you be question that you ask at a dinner party or something. But I ask it for a particular reason, which is in a lot of these interviews we have a significant third-person effect, which is I have great, badges are great for my students, badges are great for programmers, badges are great for, for the kids. But then when you ask them what badge do you want for themselves, suddenly they don't think badges could possibly represent the depth of their abilities and knowledge. And so let's start with your badges, and then we'll back out and see what that might mean for assessing those badges. Who wants to go first?
Dawn, you go.
I think Dan wants to go first.
Okay, I'm gonna have to think of my feet.
I'm gonna have the push things off onto Dan badge actually. So.
Okay.
I think only Dan can endorse that.
What would the claims be? There needs to be one that can you get a badge for just being lucky? You know, it's probably more than anything. I feel like I've just been blessed, or maybe it needs to be a religious badge that I've been blessed with some amazing opportunities out of MacArthur and this badges thing. I mean, for me, you know, people see me as kind of a shill for badges, and at some level I am, because, I mean, you know, I feel like I've been waiting all my career for this. I mean, you know, studying, you know, this notion of transcendent assessment. I mean, I've just been fighting for much of my career against the dominant paradigms in assessment and motivation, because I find that we've pretty much milked them for all they're worth, and they haven't done that much good, and they've done a lot of bad. And so to be able to be sort of in the thick of this and have been able to assemble just an awesome team, to then go in and look at what 30 awesome teams are doing with badges, and to have that be, you know, my scholarship is, I mean, I don't know, it couldn't have worked out any better for me at this point in my career. So I'll take either the blessed religious badge or the lucky great four-leaf clover badge. How's that?
Sounds good. The secular luck. I like the secular luck badge. So what do you think?
Sounds pretty good. So are we going on to my badge now, or are we?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'm terrible when I'm put on the spot for these kinds of things. So I'm going to try to be slightly provocative, I guess, because that's what I like to do when I'm put on the spot. I guess I'm going to give myself the productive skeptic badge in some ways, in that I feel like I've come into the badge stuff long after both of you have been involved in it, and I still feel I'm very new to the community, and I'm getting more and more excited and interested in it as we go along. But I came into it with a desire to sort of say, hey, wait a second, let's actually feel out how these work in the existing learning communities, the existing affinity spaces that are out there. It was not a desire initially to I guess design badges that was motivating me to be involved. It was a desire to actually understand how this interesting stuff that was going on in the design of badges actually connected to the kinds of spaces that I still think we don't talk enough about in informal learning environments. So I think what's the productive part of the productive skeptic is where I'm at right now, and that I'm still feeling like there are a number of challenges we've got in designing the next generation of badges, but when I've seen badge critics and badge skeptics sort of dismiss the idea very, very quickly, I have not been particularly pleased with that, because I think that what we have here is a real opportunity to take the questions that we've got about the efficacy of badges and the design of badges and use that to help us reframe understandings of these informal spaces. That is, not just using these informal spaces to help us understand the next generation of badges, but also using badges in recognition systems and understanding of expertise in these spaces to help us understand how informal environments also work. So that might have moved me away from the productive skeptic into being a bridge builder. So give me the bridge builder badge as well.
That's funny. So in the OBI, in the original discussions about the open badge infrastructure in Barcelona, this is going back almost 3.5 years, we tried to come up with what a good badge would be as an exemplar badge, and it was the bridge builder, for what it's worth. So I have a question. What's mine? I guess keeping it weird would be my ideal, but given my role today, I think it would be moderation. But I'd want moderation in all things. The problem with that is you'd have to have someone assess you in the negative, right? If anyone caught you being excessive in some way, then they could knock the badge down. So it would be like a negative badge in some ways. Anyway, so I want to thank both of you. We come up at the end of a little bit over the end of our hour. I think it was a great discussion. I'd love to do this over a beer. We have to have the connected TV and then the connected TV plus beer sessions. This is again, this is going to be archived and available on connectedlearning.tv probably by tomorrow, and you can share that with your networks if you found anything we had to say particularly interesting. This is our third webinar, and remember that we still have discussions going on. And on this Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific time, we have a Twitter chat using the hashtag DML badges to talk about motivation and digital badges. We hope everyone will keep up with this discussion using DML badges as the hashtag and connected learning as the hashtag during our month of badges. And productive skepticism should be included in those hashtags, I think. Although I don't know if we can. That's a really long hashtag if we include.
You only have 140 characters.
Yeah,
so.
That's pretty much it. There's also ongoing active discussions about badges on Haystack, as well as a weekly call at 8 a.m. in Pacific time, which sucks. Sorry, but it does. Through the Mozilla badge discussions. And so there's some of these discussions happening there. Next Tuesday, we have another webinar and a chat on livestream to learn about best practices when it comes to creating and setting up badge systems. I'll be in the live stream probably asking for worst practices too. I want to thank both of my guests, Sean Duncan, who doesn't have a name by him, but we all know his name, and Dan Hickey for joining me today. And thanks everyone who has been with us on live chat and watching Lurking as well. Take care, everybody. See you next week.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
Bye.